Get up. That seat isn't for people like you." The insult silenced the table. Tessa Bellamy, the curvy wedding planner, who had spent 12 hours quietly saving a billionaire's wedding from disaster, simply stood. Then, Alessandro Vitali moved. The devastatingly handsome Mafia boss, the most feared and powerful man in the room, lifted his own chair from the head table and carried it beside her. 300 elite guests stared. Camille Laurent went pale, because Alessandro had just learned what Tessa had secretly done hours earlier, and it had changed everything. The reason had begun hours before anyone told Tessa where she was allowed to sit. By 7 that morning, 300 guests had not yet arrived, and the wedding was already trying to destroy itself. The florist's refrigerated truck had broken down 40 miles away. 2 tables on the seating chart had somehow been assigned the same 12 guests. The bride's divorced parents were threatening to leave because someone had placed them within conversational distance of each other. Tessa handled each problem with the same expression she used when ordering coffee. Calm, focused, mildly inconvenienced. She found replacement flowers through a local supplier, rebuilt the seating chart on her phone, and convinced the bride's father that moving 6 tables away had been his idea. By noon, nobody knew there had been problems. Which, in Tessa's profession, meant she had done her job perfectly. Alessandro Vitali arrived shortly before the ceremony. People noticed. They always did. Conversations softened when he passed. Men who controlled companies worth hundreds of millions straightened instinctively. Women watched him with varying degrees of discretion. Tessa barely looked up. She was crouched beside a terrified 19-year-old server who had dropped an entire tray of champagne. The catering manager was furious. "You're done," he snapped at the girl. "No, she isn't." The manager turned. Tessa stood, smoothing her black dress. "The floor changed levels here," she said. "Someone removed the transition strip during setup. I reported it 2 hours ago." The manager glanced down. She was right. "If you want to fire someone," Tessa added pleasantly, "I can give you the number of the contractor." The server stared at her. The manager muttered something and walked away. "Get another tray," Tessa told the girl, "and breathe." Nobody died. Across the room, Alessandro had seen the entire exchange. He forgot about it 5 minutes later. Then something similar happened again. An elderly guest became dizzy just before the ceremony. While relatives panicked and argued over whether someone should call an ambulance, Tessa had already found the family physician among the guests, brought water, cleared space, and quietly moved curious onlookers away. Later, a junior coordinator was blamed when 12 vegetarian meals failed to arrive. Tessa checked the contract. The caterer had entered the wrong quantity. She corrected the problem without humiliating anyone. By late afternoon, Alessandro began noticing a pattern. Whenever something went wrong, people with expensive watches looked for someone to blame. Tessa looked for something to fix. That interested him. So did something else. She spoke to everyone exactly the same way. A billionaire asked where his table was. "Table 14, Mr. Reynolds. Follow the gold signs." A dishwasher asked where to find clean towels. "Second service room, left shelf. I hid extra ones there because apparently I can predict the future." Same tone, same attention, same respect. Alessandro watched the dishwasher laugh. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who adjusted themselves according to power. Their smiles changed around wealth. Their voices changed around fear. Their manners changed, depending on whether the person in front of them could be useful. Tessa Bellamy did not seem to have that setting. At one point, she nearly walked directly into him while checking her phone. She stopped. Oh. His security details stiffened, as though she had narrowly avoided colliding with a moving train. Tessa looked up at him. "You're Mr. Vitali." "I am." "Table 1. Alessandro waited. That was apparently all. She pointed across the ballroom. Gold signs. Then she walked away. For several seconds, Alessandro said nothing. His consigliere, Marco, wisely looked elsewhere. By dinner, Tessa had been working for nearly 12 hours. She had eaten half a granola bar. Standing near a loading dock. Nobody among the 300 guests knew this. They only knew the ceremony had started on time, the champagne was cold, the flowers were beautiful, and every problem seemed to disappear before becoming inconvenient enough for them to notice. That was the strange cruelty of competence. The better Tessa performed, the easier it was to believe she had done nothing at all. Alessandro noticed her near the edge of the ballroom as dinner began. Everyone else was sitting. She wasn't. She checked one table, whispered instructions to a server, adjusted something on her tablet, then quietly pressed a hand against her lower back when she thought nobody was looking. Someone else was looking. Alessandro. His elderly aunt Sofia followed his gaze. She had known him long enough to recognize curiosity on his face, mostly because it appeared so rarely. "That woman saved this wedding," Sofia said. Alessandro glanced at her. "You noticed. I notice people who prevent me from waiting 2 hours for dinner." Tessa passed their table. Sofia reached out gently. "My dear." Tessa stopped immediately. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful. Sit down for 5 minutes before you collapse and ruin it." Tessa smiled. "I'm fine." That was not a request. There was an unused chair nearby. Tessa hesitated. 5 minutes. Maybe 3. She finally sat, and across the table, Camille Laurent noticed. Her smile remained perfect, but her eyes changed. Because in Camille's world, chairs were never just chairs. They told everyone exactly where they belonged, and Tessa Bellamy had just sat in the wrong one. Camille waited until the conversation around the table had softened. Then she smiled at Tessa. It was the kind of smile that looked gracious from across a ballroom. "Excuse me," she said. "I believe there's been some confusion." Tessa looked up. Camille's voice remained pleasant. "The event staff have their own table." A few conversations stopped. Then several more. Tessa understood immediately. She had encountered women like Camille before. They rarely insulted anyone directly. Direct cruelty was vulgar. They preferred etiquette, rules, small corrections delivered sweetly enough that objecting made you look unreasonable. Sofia frowned. "I invited her." "Of course." Camille's smile never moved. "And that was very kind of you. But if staff begin sitting with guests, it can create an awkward precedent." An awkward precedent. Tessa almost admired the phrase. She could have explained that she had been standing for 12 hours. She could have mentioned the disasters she had prevented. She could have reminded Camille that half the people enjoying dinner had no idea how close they had come to eating cold entrees beside the wrong relatives under flower arrangements that never arrived. Instead, Tessa simply stood. No problem. That was what caught Alessandro's attention. Not Camille's insult. Tessa's reaction. There was no embarrassment in it. No desperate attempt to prove she belonged there. She picked up her tablet as calmly as if someone had merely informed her that a delivery had arrived at the wrong entrance. Camille had tried to reduce her. Tessa had refused to participate. Then Marco leaned toward Alessandro. "There's something you should know." Alessandro's gaze remained on Tessa. "What?" "The vendor contract from this afternoon." That got his attention. One of the wedding vendors had submitted revised payment documents after claiming a last-minute logistics surcharge. The amount was substantial enough to require authorization from the property management company operating the resort, a Vitali company. Marco lowered his voice. The planner stopped accounting from signing it. Alessandro looked at him. "Tessa?" She noticed the banking information didn't match the original vendor account. Earlier that afternoon, while solving 6 other problems, Tessa had spotted a routing discrepancy buried inside revised paperwork. She had not known who owned the resort. She had not known the contract ultimately exposed one of Alessandro's companies. She had simply noticed something wrong. Instead of ignoring it because financial security was not technically her responsibility, she had frozen the payment and insisted the vendor be verified. The vendor disappeared within an hour. The documents were fraudulent. How much? Potential exposure? Several million. Possibly more if they gained access through the payment system. Alessandro looked across the room. Tessa was walking toward the staff table. No applause followed her. Nobody knew what she had done. Not even Tessa, apparently. She had protected people who barely noticed she existed, then allowed herself to be publicly dismissed from their table without mentioning it. Alessandro stood. That movement alone changed the room. Camille noticed immediately. For one hopeful second, she assumed he was coming toward her. Instead, Alessandro reached for the back of his chair. He lifted it. Silence spread strangely fast. 300 people watched one of the most powerful men on the East Coast carry his own chair across a luxury ballroom. Tessa had just reached the staff table when she heard it being placed beside her. She turned. Alessandro sat down. Tessa stared at him, then at the head table, then back at him. You lost? No. This is the staff table. I've been informed. She glanced toward Camille. Camille had gone completely still. Tessa understood. Oh no. Alessandro raised an eyebrow. You cannot do this. I just did. You know what I mean. I rarely do. For the first time that day, Tessa looked genuinely unsettled, not intimidated, annoyed. You just turned my dinner break into an international incident. Something almost resembling amusement touched Alessandro's face. Eat. Tessa looked down. One of the catering staff had placed a plate in front of her. You moved your chair across an entire ballroom to tell me to eat? No. Good, because that would be insane. I moved it because I wanted to sit here. That was worse. Tessa stared at him. Across the room, the social hierarchy began malfunctioning. The head table was supposed to be the center of importance, except Alessandro Vitali was no longer sitting there. A senior investment executive watched him for approximately 30 seconds before quietly picking up his wine glass. Then he walked toward the staff table. Another businessman followed. Then a hotel owner. Within minutes, men who had probably never voluntarily entered an employee break room were suddenly discovering a passionate interest in sitting beside caterers. A junior server stared in horror as a billionaire asked whether the empty chair beside her was taken. Tessa watched the migration. Her lips pressed together. Alessandro noticed. You find something amusing? No. A shipping executive dragged over another chair. Tessa looked away. Her shoulders moved. You're laughing. I am absolutely not. A wealthy developer arrived carrying his own plate. There were no chairs left. He stood uncertainly beside a dishwasher. That broke her. Tessa laughed. She tried to stop. She couldn't. It was not elegant laughter. It was exhausted, helpless laughter from a woman who had spent 12 hours preventing rich people from behaving irrationally and had finally encountered a problem too ridiculous to fix. Alessandro watched her. For most of his life, people had reacted to him with caution. Respect, fear, calculation. Tessa Bellamy was laughing because his presence had accidentally caused a migration of billionaires toward a staff table. And somehow, he preferred that reaction to all the others. You realize, she whispered, none of these people wanted to sit here 5 minutes ago. I noticed. They think wherever you sit becomes the important table. They may be right. Tessa looked around at the suddenly crowded employees section. No, they're definitely idiots. Alessandro smiled. It was small, but Camille saw it from across the ballroom. So did Marco. Marco had worked beside Alessandro for 11 years. He had seen him negotiate acquisitions, survive betrayals, destroy competitors, and stare down men twice as loud as himself, without changing expression. He had almost never seen him smile, because someone called a room full of billionaires idiots. Tessa finally ate. Alessandro did not tell her what he had learned about the fraudulent contract. Not yet. He wanted to understand something first. Why did you stop the payment? Tessa paused. What payment? The vendor paperwork. Oh, that. She took another bite. The bank information changed. You noticed. It was in the paperwork. There were hundreds of pages of paperwork today. Yes. Alessandro waited for something more. There wasn't anything. You didn't know whose company was exposed? No. If you had. Tessa shrugged. I still would have stopped it. Why? Now she looked at him as if the question itself was strange. Because it was wrong. That answer stayed with him. Not because it was profound. Because to Tessa, it wasn't. She had protected a frightened server because blaming her was wrong. She had defended a junior coordinator because blaming him was wrong. She had stopped a fraudulent payment because signing it was wrong. And when Camille humiliated her publicly, Tessa had not demanded that anyone validate her worth. She already knew it. For a man accustomed to people measuring every decision against what they might gain, Tessa Bellamy was becoming unexpectedly difficult to categorize. Dinner ended. The wedding continued. Tessa returned to work. Alessandro returned to being Alessandro Vitale. By midnight, they should have returned permanently to separate worlds. There was no logical reason for the Mafia boss to see the wedding planner again. 3 days later, Alessandro discovered that one of his hotels apparently had an urgent problem. It needed an event planner, specifically Tessa Bellamy. And over the next several weeks, an extraordinary number of problems requiring her professional expertise would begin appearing throughout the Vitale business empire. 3 days later, Tessa received an email from the Vitale Grand Hotel requesting a consultation for an upcoming corporate gala. She accepted without thinking much about it. The hotel was prestigious, the budget was excellent, the event was complicated enough to be interesting. There was absolutely no reason Alessandro Vitale should have attended the first planning meeting. Yet when Tessa entered the conference room, he was sitting at the head of the table. She stopped. He looked up. Ms. Bellamy. Mr. Vitale. Tessa glanced at the hotel manager, then at Alessandro, then back at the manager. Is this gala secretly a merger? No, Alessandro said. A diplomatic summit? No. Are you getting married? Marco, standing near the wall, suddenly became fascinated by his phone. Alessandro's expression remained controlled. No. Then why are you here? Business oversight. Tessa nodded slowly. Of the centerpieces, Alessandro said nothing. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, another Vitale property needed her company. Alessandro attended that meeting too. This time, the official reason was budget review. Tessa watched the man whose companies were worth billions spend 11 minutes discussing whether cocktail tables should have ivory or champagne-colored linens. At the third event, he appeared during a menu tasting. Business oversight? She asked. Quality control. Of cheesecake? Yes. Tessa finally understood. She did not confront him. That would have made things too easy. Instead, she handed him a clipboard. Alessandro looked at it. What is this? Business oversight. It was a list of 87 place cards that needed alphabetizing. Marco turned away before anyone could see his face. Tessa expected Alessandro to refuse. He didn't. 20 minutes later, the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast was organizing place cards alphabetically, while 2 terrified assistants watched him work. Tessa checked his progress. You put McAllister after Mendoza. Alessandro looked at the cards. You're correcting me. You're doing it wrong. Nobody in the room moved. Alessandro silently corrected the card. Better, Tessa said. and walked away. That became their strange rhythm. Whenever Alessandro appeared at an event where his presence was obviously unnecessary, Tessa found him something ordinary to do. Guest lists, table numbers, vendor confirmations. Once, ribbon samples. He completed every assignment. At first, his employees found this terrifying. Then they found it fascinating. Eventually, even Marco began quietly enjoying it, because Tessa did something almost nobody else dared to do. She treated Alessandro as useful without treating him as important, and Alessandro discovered that he liked it. He liked watching her work, not because she performed competence dramatically, because she didn't. Tessa noticed details other people ignored. A bride repeatedly checking whether her divorced parents were comfortable. A waiter hiding a limp. A nervous groom pretending not to panic. She solved problems before they became scenes, and she never changed her voice depending on someone's bank account. Their familiarity grew in fragments. A shared coffee during a delayed rehearsal. A look across a ballroom when a drunken uncle reached for a microphone. Tessa silently shaking her head. Alessandro quietly instructing security to remove the microphone. Once, during a painfully elaborate discussion about floral installations, Tessa caught him checking his watch. "You can leave. I'm listening. You've looked at your watch 4 times. I have other responsibilities." "Yes, I've heard rumors you run some companies." His mouth almost curved. "Several. Go do that." He stayed. Tessa began noticing things too. Alessandro never embarrassed employees publicly. He remembered names. He tipped service workers without making a performance of generosity. And whenever someone powerful treated someone beneath them badly, his attention sharpened. She understood why he had moved the chair now. It had never been pity. That mattered more than she wanted it to. Then Julian Mercer arrived. Julian was a senior executive for one of the luxury hotel groups hosting an event Tessa was coordinating. He was handsome in an easy, uncomplicated way. He laughed often. He flirted openly. And unlike Alessandro, Julian did not disguise his interest as concern about linen colors. "Tessa," Julian said, during one site inspection, "have dinner with me." She looked up from her tablet. That was subtle. I've been told subtlety wastes time. Across the ballroom, Alessandro stopped listening to a financial report. Tessa noticed. So did Marco. "Dinner?" Tessa asked. Julian smiled. "Dinner." Alessandro appeared beside them with remarkable efficiency. "Mercer." Julian turned. "Vitale. I wasn't aware you were involved in this event." "I own the hotel." "I'm aware." Tessa looked between them. There was a pause. Alessandro glanced at her tablet. "Have we finalized the emergency access routes?" Tessa blinked. "Yes." "The loading schedule?" "Yes." "Security?" "Yes." "Parking?" "Yes." Julian smiled. Tessa almost did. Alessandro had never cared about parking in his life. "Anything else?" she asked. His eyes moved briefly toward Julian. "No." "Excellent." She turned back to Julian. "Dinner sounds nice." Alessandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tessa saw it. That changed everything. Because until then, she had suspected Alessandro enjoyed being around her. Now she knew. And knowing was much more entertaining. Over the next several weeks, Alessandro developed an extraordinary professional interest in Julian Mercer. If Julian attended an event, Alessandro appeared. If Julian spoke to Tessa, Alessandro suddenly had a question. If Julian made her laugh, some urgent matter of business oversight mysteriously required Alessandro's presence within conversational distance. Tessa never accused him of jealousy. She did something crueler. She let him pretend. At one reception, Julian brought her coffee. Alessandro appeared 5 minutes later. I thought you disliked that blend. Tessa stared at him. How do you know what coffee I drink? Silence. Marco closed his eyes. Alessandro recovered. You complained about it once. 6 weeks ago. I have a good memory. For coffee? For relevant information. Tessa looked at Julian, then back at Alessandro. Business oversight? Yes. She smiled sweetly and handed him a box. Wonderful. These wedding favors need ribbons. He looked inside. There were 200 of them. Julian laughed. Alessandro took the box. By the end of the evening, every ribbon was tied. Perfectly. What began as curiosity had become familiarity. Familiarity had become anticipation. Alessandro stopped inventing reasons only to observe Tessa. Sometimes he simply found himself looking for her. Tessa stopped wondering why he appeared. Sometimes she found herself expecting him. Neither of them named what was happening. They did not need to. Other people had already begun noticing, including Camille Laurent. At first, Camille had dismissed the chair incident as one of Alessandro's unpredictable demonstrations of principle. Then she heard about the meetings, the galas, the hotel events, the increasingly absurd frequency with which Alessandro Vitale had apparently developed opinions about weddings. Most importantly, she saw the way he looked at Tessa, not with charity, not amusement, interest, respect, something warmer beginning beneath both. Camille understood social hierarchy better than almost anyone, and she understood that hierarchies became dangerous when powerful people stopped obeying them. So at an engagement celebration several weeks later, she decided to remind everyone exactly who Tessa Bellamy was. Not Alessandro, not privately. Everyone. And this time, the insult would be delivered so elegantly that nobody could accuse Camille of insulting her at all. The engagement celebration was exactly the kind of event Camille understood. Not because she had organized it. Tessa had. Camille understood something else far better. Rooms. Who entered first? Who received introductions? Who was seated near power? Who was acknowledged? Who was expected to remain useful and invisible? By then, Tessa had spent months moving comfortably through rooms like this, without ever pretending they belonged to her. That, somehow, irritated Camille more than ambition would have. Tessa was near the dining room entrance when Camille approached with 2 women from prominent families. Tessa! Tessa looked up from her tablet. Camille, what a beautiful evening. Thank you. You really are extraordinary at this. The compliment was loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Tessa recognized the setup immediately. Camille continued, I was just telling everyone what wonderful help you've been to all of us. There it was. Help. A harmless word. Almost. One of the women smiled politely. Camille touched Tessa's arm with practiced warmth. It must be strange, though. What must? All the attention lately. Tessa waited. Camille lowered her voice, just enough to suggest intimacy, while remaining perfectly audible. Alessandro has always been generous with people who work for families close to him. I only hope nobody has misunderstood his kindness as something more personal. Several people nearby became very interested in conversations they were no longer having. Across the room, Alessandro turned. He had heard enough. His first instinct was immediate. End it. One sentence from him could do that. Possibly one look. Then Tessa glanced toward him. Their eyes met. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Don't. Months earlier, Alessandro had moved a chair. This time, she did not need him to move anything. Tessa placed her tablet on a nearby table. You know what's interesting about weddings? She asked. Camille smiled cautiously. I'm sure you'll tell me. I've worked with families who spend more on flowers than most people earn in 5 years. A few guests looked over. I've watched people arrive in cars worth more than houses. I've planned dinners where one bottle of wine costs more than my first office lease. Camille's smile tightened. And I've learned something. Tessa's voice never rose. The people with the most class are almost never the ones who spend the most time proving they have it. Silence spread. Camille's expression changed. Only slightly. Tessa continued. A wedding is strange that way. Everyone sees the beautiful room. Nobody sees the dishwasher who stayed 3 hours late because someone else called in sick, or the server who memorized 6 allergy lists, or the coordinator who got screamed at because somebody's uncle didn't like his table. A few members of the event staff had stopped moving. They're called the help sometimes. Tessa smiled faintly. I've never understood why people say that like it's an insult. Camille's face hardened. Tessa looked directly at her. If someone helps you, maybe the classy thing is to remember they're a person while they're doing it. No attack, no accusation, nothing Camille could easily fight. That was what made it devastating. Tessa picked up her tablet. Now, if you'll excuse me, the wonderful help has a dessert service to supervise. She walked away. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sofia Vitali quietly lifted her champagne glass. To the help. One of the servers nearby laughed before catching himself. Others raised their glasses. Not everyone. Enough. Camille stood perfectly still. Her attempt to establish hierarchy had produced the opposite result. Alessandro had not said a word. He watched Tessa cross the room. Something in his expression had changed. At the first wedding, he had admired how calmly she endured humiliation. Tonight, he admired something more important. She had defended herself without becoming cruel. She had defended everyone standing behind her, too. Later, he found her near the service corridor. You told me not to interfere. You noticed. I notice relevant information. Tessa smiled. That line again? It remains accurate. He studied her. I could have stopped her. I know. I wanted to. I know that too. She looked toward the ballroom. But if you fight every battle for me, eventually people will think I only win because you're standing behind me. Alessandro said nothing. Tessa looked back at him. Sometimes I need you to let me stand there by myself. For a man who had built his life around control, protection had always meant action. Remove the threat. Solve the problem. Use power. Tessa was asking him to understand another kind of protection. Restraint. Respect. Trust. I'm learning, he said. Her expression softened. I noticed. For once, neither of them made a joke, and that quiet moment frightened Camille more than the public confrontation had. Because Alessandro was no longer merely fascinated by Tessa Bellamy. He listened to her. Weeks later, Tessa received the biggest opportunity of her career. The Ashford wedding. 2 political families. International guest. Multiple venues. A contract large enough to transform Bellamy Events from a respected boutique company into one of the most sought-after luxury planning firms in the region. Tessa spent 3 days preparing her proposal. She won the contract. Or thought she had. Then came the private meeting. The bride's mother closed the conference room door. There is one concern. Tessa already disliked the sentence. The family representative folded his hands. Your association with Mr. Vitali. Tessa became still. My company has worked on events at several Vitali properties. That isn't what we mean. Of course it wasn't. The bride's mother smiled awkwardly. There has been gossip. Tessa waited. The representative continued. The photographs, the dinners, his appearances at your events. And we are planning a very traditional celebration. Tessa almost laughed. There it was again. A harmless word, doing dishonest work. Traditional. What exactly are you asking me? Nobody wanted to say it. Finally, the bride's mother did. We would prefer that, during the engagement period and through the wedding, You stop appearing socially with Mr. Vitale." Tessa stared at her. The woman rushed to soften it. "This isn't personal. It sounds surprisingly personal. Our guests are extremely prominent. So are Alessandro's. That's not the issue." Tessa understood then. It was not merely that Alessandro was a mafia boss. It was the spectacle they believed she created beside him. A woman like Tessa. A man like Alessandro. Too visible. Too unexpected. Too easy for gossip columns to turn into entertainment. The representative shifted uncomfortably. "We simply don't want the event to feel..." He stopped. Tessa waited. Common. There it was. The room became very quiet. The contract was worth more than anything her company had ever signed. It would allow her to hire permanent staff, open a larger office, take projects she had spent years working toward. All she had to do was agree. Alessandro did not know about the condition. He had not asked her to sacrifice anything. Nobody outside this room might ever know. Tessa closed the contract folder. "No." The bride's mother blinked. "Perhaps you should take some time." "I don't need time. You understand what you're giving up?" "Yes." Tessa stood. "That's why the answer matters." She walked out without the contract. For the first time in years, she cried in her car. Not because she regretted the decision. Because dignity could be expensive even when you knew exactly what it was worth. And Tessa had just received the bill. She told her employees the contract had fallen through. She did not tell Alessandro. Camille did. At a charity dinner 2 weeks later, publicly. "What a shame about the Ashford wedding," Camille said. Alessandro looked at Tessa. Tessa's expression told him immediately that something was wrong. Camille continued. "Such an enormous contract to lose over something so unnecessary." "What are you talking about?" Alessandro asked. Tessa closed her eyes briefly. Camille smiled. "They asked her to stop seeing you." The table went silent. Alessandro turned slowly toward Tessa. "They did what?" "It's handled." "No." His voice became quieter. "That was worse." "How much was the contract?" "Alessandro." "How much?" Camille watched with satisfaction. This was the ending she expected. The billionaire would write a check. The wedding planner would be compensated. Everyone would be returned to their proper position. Alessandro reached for his phone. Tessa put her hand over it. "No." He looked at her. "I can replace the contract." "I know. I can give your company 10 contracts larger than that one." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I don't want them." That stopped him. Tessa removed her hand. "I didn't turn down their money, so I could take yours." Something shifted in his face. She spoke more quietly. "I made a choice. It cost me something. Let it cost me something." He stared at her. "You want me to do nothing?" "No." She held his gaze. "I want you to respect why I did it." That was harder. Alessandro could replace money. Destroy obstacles. Open doors. Close them. He could make one phone call and ensure Tessa never worried about another contract for the rest of her career. But doing that now would turn her principal into another thing his power had purchased. So Alessandro put his phone down. Camille's satisfaction disappeared, because Tessa had just refused the one thing Camille assumed every woman wanted from Alessandro Vitale: access to his power. And Alessandro had done something perhaps even more surprising. He had listened. The story should have ended there. It didn't. 3 days later, the Ashford family discovered that several Vitale-owned companies were reconsidering future events at their properties. Alessandro insisted he had issued no threat. Technically, that was true. Powerful people were simply very talented at anticipating what powerful men might dislike. The Ashfords panicked. They contacted Tessa. The original contract was restored. The fee was increased. No conditions. Tessa listened to the offer, then added one condition of her own. The family representative sounded stunned. You want an apology? Yes. To you? No. That confused him. Tessa looked through the glass wall of her office at her team. The assistants who worked 18-hour days. The coordinators who absorbed insults with smiles. The people wealthy clients often remembered only when something went wrong. To my employees. The room went silent. If you want Bellamy events, Tessa said, you will meet my team, and you will apologize for suggesting that the people who create your celebration make it common. When Alessandro heard about her condition later, he finally understood what made Tessa different from almost everyone he knew. Given access to power, most people used it to move themselves closer to the important table. For Tessa used it to make room for everyone who had been told they belonged somewhere else. And for the first time in Alessandro Vitale's life, admiration became something much more dangerous. Love. The Ashford family apologized, not through a lawyer, not through an assistant, in person. Tessa insisted on that. Her entire team gathered in the Bellamy events office on a Monday morning, confused about why one of the wealthiest families in the state had requested a private meeting. The same representative who had once explained why Tessa's personal life might make their wedding feel common, now stood in front of the coordinators, assistants, and junior staff whose work he had never bothered to learn. His apology was uncomfortable. Imperfect, but real. Tessa did not humiliate him. She did not make a speech. She simply made sure every employee heard the words. Then she asked her team whether they still wanted the wedding. That surprised everyone, including Alessandro, when he heard about it later. You asked them? They're the ones who'll have to work it. It's your company. Exactly. Tessa's team voted yes. So Bellamy Events accepted the largest contract in its history, not because Alessandro bought it for her, not because his money rescued her. Tessa had won the contract once with competence. She regained it on terms that respected her people. That distinction mattered, especially to Alessandro. For most of his life, power had been simple. If a door was closed, he opened it. If someone created a problem, he removed the problem. If something valuable could be protected with money, influence, or fear, he used whichever worked fastest. Tessa had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes helping someone meant refusing to take control of their victory. He had almost failed that lesson. The night Camille revealed the lost contract, every instinct in him had demanded action. Write the check. Replace the money. Punish the family. Fix everything. Tessa had stopped him with one sentence. I want you to respect why I did it. He thought about those words for weeks. Then, one evening after an event, he found Tessa alone in the ballroom checking the final vendor invoices. The guests were gone. The staff were clearing tables. Alessandro approached. Tessa did not look up. If you're here for business oversight, those chairs need stacking. He glanced at the chairs. I own the building. Congratulations. That usually exempts me from stacking furniture. Then your business oversight credentials remain questionable. He smiled, this time openly. Tessa finally looked at him. Something in his expression made her put down the papers. What? Alessandro was silent for a moment. He was a man accustomed to entering conversations, knowing exactly what outcome he wanted. This one was different. I spent years believing that protecting people meant making their problems disappear. Tessa listened. You're very good at making problems disappear. I know. That sounded extremely modest. I'm trying something new. She smiled. Then he became serious again. When you lost that contract, I wanted to replace it before you could feel the loss. I know. I thought that was helping you. I know that too. But it would have made your decision mine. Tessa said nothing. Alessandro understood now. If I had replaced what you lost immediately, then your dignity would still have depended on what I was willing to give you. Her expression softened. Yes. The word was quiet. No accusation, just truth. Alessandro looked across the empty ballroom. I don't want that. Neither do I. I don't want you beside me because I put you there. That caught her. He looked back at her. I want you there because you chose to be. For once, Tessa Bellamy had no clever answer. Months earlier, Alessandro had carried a chair across a ballroom because someone else had tried to define where she belonged. At the time, Tessa had believed the gesture was the important part. Now she understood something else. The chair had never mattered because Alessandro gave her a place beside him. It mattered because he had publicly rejected the idea that anyone else had the right to decide her place at all. And now he was giving her something far more difficult for a man like him to give. Choice. Tessa stepped closer. You've improved. At what? Listening. I was already excellent at listening. No, you were excellent at waiting silently until people agreed with you. He considered that. There's a difference? A significant one. He almost smiled again. Tessa reached for his hand. It was a small gesture. No audience. No elite guests watching. No social statement. Alessandro looked down at their joined hands. Then at her. This time, he did not decide what happened next. He waited. Tessa rose slightly onto her toes and kissed him. Softly. Briefly. When she stepped back, Alessandro remained perfectly still. Tessa studied him. Are you all right? Yes. You look confused. I'm not confused. You look extremely confused. I'm reconsidering the duration. She laughed. He pulled her gently back toward him. The second kiss lasted considerably longer. From the far side of the ballroom, Marco walked through a doorway, saw them, and immediately turned around. He had waited months for this. He could wait another 10 minutes, maybe 20. The Ashford wedding became a success. Then something unexpected happened. People heard why Tessa had initially walked away from it. Not every detail. Enough. The story spread through the circles that mattered. A planner had refused the biggest contract of her career rather than accept a condition that demeaned her. Then, when the client returned, she had demanded respect not only for herself, but for her employees. Some people thought she was difficult. Better people thought she was exactly who they wanted managing the most important events of their lives. Bellamy Events began receiving calls. Then more calls. Within months, Tessa hired additional coordinators. She moved into a larger office. Her waiting list grew. Alessandro never invested, never purchased a stake, never quietly bought her building. He considered all three. Tessa somehow discovered this. She threatened to assign him responsibility for assembling 800 wedding favors if he tried. He believed her, but so he did something much harder. He watched her succeed without trying to own any part of the success. And Tessa, in return, allowed him into the parts of her life that could not be purchased. Her exhausted late-night dinners, her terrible habit of forgetting where she left her keys, her Sunday mornings, her worries. Her jokes, her trust. Camille watched all of it, from increasingly irrelevant distances. She had spent years believing the woman who belonged beside Alessandro Vitale would need the correct family, the correct body, the correct social connections, the correct seat. She had misunderstood him. More importantly, she had misunderstood Tessa. Tessa had never been trying to climb into Camille's world. She had built one of her own. And Alessandro had not elevated her into it. He had simply learned how to enter without taking over. Months after the first wedding, another major celebration brought many of the same powerful families together. Bellamy Events was running it. Tessa was in command, and Alessandro Vitale was not supposed to attend. At least, that was the plan. Plans involving Alessandro had developed a strange tendency to change whenever Tessa Bellamy was involved.
Alessandro arrived 40 minutes before dinner. Nobody had invited him. At least, nobody admitted to inviting him. Tessa was standing near the service entrance with a headset in one ear and 3 different problems competing for her attention when the atmosphere in the room changed. She did not need to turn around. She had learned that particular silence. Power had entered the building. One of her junior coordinators hurried toward her. "Tessa." "No. You don't even know what I'm going to say." "Yes, I do." The coordinator lowered her voice. "Mr. Vitale is here." Tessa closed her eyes. Of course he is. He doesn't have a seat. That caused considerably more panic than it should have. Within seconds, the venue manager appeared. "We can rearrange the head table." "No. We could add another place beside the governor." "No. There's a private dining room upstairs. He came to a wedding, not witness protection." The manager stared at her. Tessa removed her headset. Across the ballroom stood Alessandro Vitale, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and completely unbothered by the chaos his unexpected arrival had created. People were already noticing him. Several guests had begun adjusting themselves accordingly. Tessa walked toward him. "You weren't invited." "Hello to you, too. You don't have a seat. I've survived worse." "Why are you here?" "Business oversight." Tessa stared at him. Alessandro's expression did not change. She looked around the ballroom. "This is not one of your hotels." "No." "You don't own the catering company." "No." "You have no financial interest in the wedding." "Correct. So what business are you overseeing?" He looked at her. "Yours." Tessa tried not to smile, failed slightly. "You've gotten worse at lying." "I've had less practice recently." Behind her, 2 staff members were attempting to move an entire table to create space near the front. Tessa turned. "Stop!" Everyone froze. She looked around. Every guest table was full. The only empty chair she could see was near the back of the room, at the staff table. Tessa pointed. "There." The venue manager looked horrified. "Tessa." "What?" "That's the staff table." She looked at Alessandro. For one brief second, neither of them spoke. They both remembered. Another ballroom. Another wedding. Another chair. Except everything was different now. Nobody had insulted Tessa. Nobody was ordering her away. Nobody needed Alessandro to make a statement. There were no social lines to redraw. There was simply an empty chair, beside people working the event. Alessandro looked at it, then at Tessa. "Perfect." He walked across the ballroom and sat down. Just like that. The staff table became very quiet. A young server holding a bread roll halfway to his mouth stopped chewing. One of Tessa's assistants stared at Alessandro as though a tiger had voluntarily joined their lunch break. Alessandro unfolded his napkin. "Please continue." Nobody continued. Tessa watched from across the room. Months earlier, executives had followed Alessandro to the staff table because they believed importance moved wherever he moved. This time, nobody followed, and that made the moment better. He was not performing. He was not correcting anyone. He had nothing to prove. He simply sat where there was room. Tessa returned to work. The ceremony moved into dinner without disaster. Almost. A missing vegetarian entree was replaced. A 5-year-old flower girl disappeared and was found beneath a dessert table, eating frosting. The groom's uncle attempted to request a microphone. Tessa prevented that catastrophe personally. For nearly 2 hours, Alessandro remained at the staff table. He spoke with a lighting technician, asked a server about college, listened while one of Tessa's coordinators complained about a florist who believed delivery windows were philosophical suggestions. Nobody around him seemed comfortable for the first 20 minutes. By the end of dinner, someone had asked him to pass the bread. He did. No empire collapsed. Finally, Tessa got a break. 7 minutes. Possibly 8 if nobody got divorced before dessert. She walked toward the staff table. There was one empty chair. Beside Alessandro. Of course there was. Tessa sat. You stayed. You sound surprised. You've been sitting beside the catering team for 2 hours. They're interesting. More interesting than the head table? Considerably. Tessa smiled. For a moment, they simply watched the room. Her room, in a way. Not because she owned the venue. Because everywhere Tessa looked, she could see evidence of something she had built. Her coordinators moved confidently through the crowd. Her assistants solved problems without waiting for permission. Clients trusted her. Employees trusted her more. Bellamy Events was no longer the small company wealthy families hired and forgot. Her reputation had changed. Not because Alessandro had placed her beside powerful people, because Tessa had become powerful in the only way that mattered to her, on her own terms. Alessandro understood that now. He had learned to stand beside her without standing in front of her. Tessa leaned back. Tired? He asked. Extremely. Have you eaten? She looked at him suspiciously. Don't start. You haven't? I had almonds. That is not dinner. It was 12 almonds. A feast. I appreciate your support. A server placed a plate in front of her. Tessa looked at Alessandro. He looked innocent. You did this. I have no idea what you mean. You ordered me food. An outrageous accusation. She picked up her fork. You're becoming controlling again. I'm ensuring basic human survival. Business oversight? Exactly. Tessa laughed. Alessandro looked at her. Then, without saying anything, he shifted his chair slightly closer. Tessa noticed. She said nothing. A minute later, movement near the ballroom entrance caught her attention. Julian Mercer had arrived. He spotted Tessa, smiled, and began walking towards them. Tessa felt Alessandro's chair move again. Closer. She slowly turned her head. Alessandro was looking straight ahead. Did you just move your chair? No. You absolutely moved your chair. The floor is uneven. Tessa looked down. The floor is marble. A structural issue? Alessandro. He picked up his water. Perhaps you should contact the venue. Julian was getting closer. Alessandro's chair moved another inch. Tessa stared at him. The most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, a man who could silence boardrooms by entering them, was attempting to defend his romantic territory with furniture. She began laughing. Alessandro frowned. I fail to see what's amusing. Nothing. You're laughing? I am absolutely not. It was the same lie she had told him at the first wedding. That made her laugh harder. Julian reached the table. Tessa. Julian. He glanced at Alessandro. Vitale. Mercer. There was a pause. Julian looked at the tiny amount of space remaining between their chairs, then at Tessa. His smile widened. I was going to ask you to dance. Alessandro's expression became perfectly neutral. Tessa considered the invitation with exaggerated seriousness. She could almost feel the jealousy radiating beside her. Then she looked at Alessandro. Months ago, he had moved his chair across a ballroom. That gesture had changed everything. At the time, 300 people had watched. They had assumed the story was about a powerful man publicly choosing a woman everyone else had dismissed. But that had never been the whole story. Alessandro had noticed Tessa because she treated powerless people with dignity. Tessa had noticed Alessandro because, beneath all his power, he was capable of recognizing character when everyone else was measuring status. Neither had rescued the other. They had changed each other. Tessa taught Alessandro that love was not another form of possession. that protecting someone sometimes meant respecting their right to fight their own battles. That power was not proven by controlling where someone stood. Sometimes it was proven by making room, and Alessandro had given Tessa something she had never asked for, but had quietly deserved. Not status, recognition, not permission to belong. Proof that the right person would never require her to prove she belonged in the first place. Tessa looked back at Julian. "Maybe later?" Julian laughed. "I know when I'm defeated." "You're not defeated," Tessa said. Beside her, Alessandro relaxed slightly. "You're just being aggressively outmaneuvered by a chair." Julian looked at Alessandro, then at the chair. "I see." He walked away, laughing. Alessandro remained dignified for approximately 3 seconds. "Maybe later?" Tessa turned toward him. "Oh, this is going to be fun." "What does maybe later mean?" "It means maybe later. You don't dance at weddings." "I dance sometimes." "I have never seen you dance." "You've also never seen me scuba dive. That doesn't mean I can't." "Do you scuba dive?" "No." "That is irrelevant." Tessa laughed again. Then she reached beneath the table and took his hand. Alessandro stopped talking. Around them, the wedding continued. Glasses clinked. Servers moved between tables. Music filled the room. Nobody stared at them. Nobody cared where they were sitting. And that was exactly how Tessa wanted it. At the first wedding, Camille had told her that a certain chair was not for people like her. Alessandro had responded by moving his own. Back then, the gesture had been public, defiant, a declaration that status could be rearranged with something as simple as choosing where to sit. But tonight, there was no Camille. No humiliation. No audience waiting for a statement. No one telling Tessa where she belonged. Alessandro looked at their joined hands, then at her. "You know," Tessa said, "there are much better seats available." "I know." "The head table has excellent champagne." "I know." "And you're sitting beside a box of spare napkins." He glanced at the box. "I've endured worse." Tessa smiled. "Then why are you still here?" Alessandro looked at her as though the answer had become the simplest thing in his life. "Because you are." Tessa's smile softened. No billionaire could have bought a better answer. No title could have made it more valuable. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder. Alessandro moved his chair 1 final inch closer. This time, she let him pretend it had been the floor. Because real status had never been determined by which table someone was allowed to sit at. It was revealed in how they treated the people who were never invited to the table in the first place. And Alessandro Vitale had once moved his chair beside Tessa Bellamy because everyone else was trying to tell her where she belonged. Now he sat beside her for a much simpler reason. Because wherever Tessa chose to sit, that was where he wanted to be.